Good morning, everybody. My name is Sameeksha Desai, and I am the Director of Special Projects and Advisory Support at the Kauffman Foundation. And I'd like to welcome you to this month's Entrepreneurship Issue Forum. It is all about immigration and entrepreneurship, and we'll be taking a close look at the knowledge landscape. We run these entrepreneurship issue forums as part of an effort to foster a two-way communication between researchers and data and evidence and practitioners and entrepreneurs and their lived experiences in order to encourage a two-way flow of communication. And so one of the reasons that we do this forum is because we want to make sure that perspectives that come from research and data and work, working with entrepreneurship constituents and with policymakers all come together and can flow together. And so in today's forum, we're going to have three sessions. The first one is going to be a session about what we know about the effect of immigrant entrepreneurs on the economy. The second is a panel on why immigrants start businesses and what does it mean? What does it mean for communities? What does the process look like? What do immigrants encounter and what are the motivations? And then the third session is a roundtable that will bring together researchers and practitioners to talk through what they have learned. What are their perspectives on priorities and on what interventions related to immigrant support and entrepreneurship support in immigrant communities, what do those look like? And so one thing that I just want to remind everybody is that we bring people together to have these conversations and to bring knowledge together on a specific topic. The Kauffman Foundation takes no legislative or political position on any of the discussions here, and our contributors and our participants are bringing in their own perspectives from a wide range of topics and a wide range of fields. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our moderator for our first panel. Her name is Haneul Choi, and she is a PhD candidate at Arizona State University. And Haneul, please take it away.
Good morning, everyone. It's really good to see you here in this awesome panel. Today, we have three speakers in our panel. Sariker, Dr. Mora, who is the Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, University of Missouri. And then we have Dr. Sariker, who is Senior Research Scientist at Wellesley College. And then we have Javier Miranda, who is Principal Economist at U.S. Census Bureau. We will start this panel by listening to Dr. Mora.
Yes, good morning, everybody, and thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to talk about immigrant entrepreneurs with you this morning. I also thank the Kauffman Foundation for inviting me to be here this morning. First of all, I wanted to mention that my other fellow panelists, I know, are going to give a broader overview about what the status of immigrant entrepreneurs is and the impact, talk about some of the numbers on the economy. Much of my research has focused on Hispanic entrepreneurs and Hispanic immigrant entrepreneurs. So I will share some brief comments with you, and I look forward to some of the Q&A that we'll have in a short while. I wanted to point out, I have 5 takeaways that I want to share with you as part of my opening remarks. And again, we can get into more details in the Q&A. When we think about Hispanic-owned businesses, one of the factors to point out is that they account and generate for about $700 billion into the U.S. economy, according to the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce Foundation. And much of the growth in terms of our business sector has been driven by Hispanic entrepreneurs. According to studies out of Stanford, for example, in the past decade, Hispanic entrepreneurs accounted for about 34% of business growth compared to about 1% overall for new business growth. A second point I wanted to mention is that when we think about Hispanic entrepreneurs, one of the reasons we've seen such a large growth is because we have a growing Hispanic population. So that might not be much of a surprise. When we think about a population that grows, we would expect to also get a growth in the number of business owners. However, some of my research with Alberto Davila and I, for the past decade or so, we've been examining Hispanic entrepreneurs. And we have found that in addition to the growing numbers of Hispanics, the entrepreneurship patterns have increased because there's a growing intensity within the Hispanic population. A third point, and this is particularly relevant for this session, a lot of the growth among Hispanic-owned businesses has occurred because of immigration. Immigrants have driven much of the growth in Hispanic-owned businesses. And of interest, behind the numbers, if we dig a little bit deeper, a lot of the growth in Hispanic immigrant-owned businesses has been driven by women. A fourth point I would like to make is that much of this growth, it should be mentioned, has been at the very small level or the micro enterprise level. Where the vast majority of the Hispanic-owned businesses, as well as Hispanic immigrant-owned businesses, have been non-employer firms. And so that does raise the question in terms of in terms of thinking about scalability and room for growth. And finally, I wanted to point out that given our COVID environment, which is one of the biggest stories of not just the labor market, but other sectors, business sector, et cetera, there is concern about how the COVID environment may have affected immigrant entrepreneurs. And part of this has to do with the types of jobs and the types of industries where we see them clustered, particularly women. Women entrepreneurs, as well as Hispanic immigrant women entrepreneurs, have tended to have businesses disproportionately in the hospitality and services sectors. And we know that these sectors were disproportionately impacted by COVID, where we still see job losses in those particular sectors. And so there is a concern moving forward, how will immigrant-owned businesses, and particularly those owned by women, continue to play a role in the economic recovery. In the past Great Recession, which we saw about a decade ago, Hispanic immigrant entrepreneurs, including women, were a driving force in terms of the recovery. Given what we're seeing with COVID, we don't know if we will see those same type of impacts. So I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to, again, when we get into some Q&A in a short while. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mora. Next speaker is Dr. Sariker. Yes.
Everyone, I'm going to start sharing my slides, and hopefully this will work fine. I don't have too much in the slides. I'm just going to show you a few exhibits to sort of support the idea of what I'm talking about. And I'm looking at immigrant entrepreneurship quite broadly in the US. This is something I've been studying for the past 6 years. And when we first started looking at the topic, most of the research was on immigrant self-employment. And immigrants are more likely to be self-employed than natives, and there are many reasons why that may happen. And one of the things we were curious about was, how do we actually define an immigrant entrepreneur? It probably goes beyond being self-employed. It might be a self-employed person who's incorporated their business. That's one definition. We could look at owners of firms. In particular, we can look at recently founded firms. Older firms can be tricky because once they become public, it's hard to figure out who initially owned the firm. We might be interested in particular employer firms. And how about firms that have mixed owner teams, immigrant native owner teams? We also looked at and have looked at these various definitions of founding teams. So immigrants are members of initial firm founding teams. We know of famous examples of very large firms like Google, Facebook have had members of founding teams being immigrants, but also just local smaller firms are very likely to have that as well. So when we started looking at that, we were intrigued about some of those trends. So if we look at the 90s and 2000s, depending on the definition of exactly what we mean by immigrant entrepreneur or immigrant entrepreneur's firm, we see different levels of prevalence in the economy. We also see increasing trends independent of basically what definition we look at. So if we look at the share of new firms that have at least one immigrant entrepreneur, that share was increasing in the 90s and 2000s, reaching about 35% of all new firms. And then if we look at share of the entrepreneurs themselves who are immigrant, that reached about 25% in the end of 2000s. Same thing for immigrant-owned firms and newly founded employer firms that are immigrant-owned. It's about 25%. And those shares have continued to increase even since we first started looking at the topic. And not surprisingly to anyone who's thought about these issues, the shares are much higher in places where there are a lot of immigrants. So we can think about these immigrant gateway states like California, New York, Florida, Massachusetts, where we are being one of them. The shares of immigrant entrepreneurs, immigrant-owned firms in those places is a lot higher than you would see in other parts of the country. But in all cases, independent of the definition, we see that immigrants will outperform themselves in terms of the firm creation versus their population share. So in most places, like say California, has about 27% of their population share being immigrants, but it's up to half of all new firms that are founded that are actually owned by at least one immigrant. So US average, again, it's about 13% immigrant population, but more than just over a quarter of all new firms are founded by immigrants. So this overperformance shows up locally and nationally across the board. How about employment? So we can think about some employment creation. Obviously, we know from previous literature that these new firms are a big source of employment creation in the economy. And while the immigrant-owned firms on average are a tiny bit smaller than the native-owned firms, really the difference is quite marginal. So you can think about in these newly founded immigrant-owned firms or newly founded employer firms, about a quarter of all job creation is done by immigrant-owned firms. So that's a very large number. I would love to put sort of more counts to it. So can I count it somehow? But it becomes very hard because a lot of employment is in large established firms. Some of them were founded originally by immigrants, like I mentioned, Google, Facebook, or maybe second generation immigrants like Apple and Amazon. It's hard to say what to do about that. My sort of argument is just that there's a lot of jobs being created by immigrant entrepreneurs. So if we dig a little bit deeper even, this is from some very recent work where we were looking at the share of immigrant entrepreneurs in high-tech versus low-tech firms, and looking at states and some key tech clusters. So the tech clusters are colored here in red. And you can see the correlation between the immigrant entrepreneur share in high tech versus low tech. They're very highly correlated. And wherever you look at, so San Jose is the very top point there with more than 60% of high tech and low tech firms being owned by immigrant entrepreneurs. San Jose's population share of immigrants is about 38%. So even in places where there's a lot of immigrants, even there we see this vast overrepresentation of immigrant entrepreneurs relative to their population share. And that seems to be true pretty much across the board. So it's not just your mom and pop restaurants and dry cleaners and all these sort of high street kind of firms. It's really high tech and low tech and everything in between that these immigrant entrepreneurs are running. So that's very, we thought it was very powerful, very interesting, and interesting to see how correlated those two actually are. And then I don't want to take too much time, so this is the last thing I will say. We just in sort of more recent work, we also looked at more broadly kind of where do these immigrant-owned firms are being found. It is true that they're highly represented in these various service sectors where they create a lot of jobs. In more recent work that's just coming out, we've also looked at the employees. So who are the people that these immigrant entrepreneurs hire? And we will show even more evidence in an upcoming paper that I encourage everyone to look at, but they definitely hire a lot of other immigrants, so immigrants from the same ethnic backgrounds as themselves, but they also hire immigrants from other ethnic backgrounds as well as the US natives. So when we see these immigrant-owned firms in different sectors where they create jobs, they do create jobs for everyone, not just other immigrants. So this is something that's quite worth considering when we enter the pandemic recovery. Think about a half of the a quarter of the all new firms being owned by immigrants, the same sort of share of the new jobs in those firms, about twice the population average of the immigrants themselves. Those are things that we cannot lose in the pandemic recovery. We have to make sure that we can keep the businesses alive and the jobs going. So thank you. I'm gonna give Dr. Miranda the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sami, and thank you the Kauffman Foundation for inviting us to participate in this panel. It's a great honor to be with all of you. This is work that we've been doing with Pierre Azulay, Ben Jones, and Danny Kim. We are using a lot of confidential Census Bureau data, and we are required to tell you that the views that we're going to express today are our own. They do not represent the views of the Census Bureau. And of course, all the results that we're going to share with you today have been reviewed to ensure that no confidential information is disclosed. So, so thank you again for inviting us to talk about this. This is obviously, immigration is an important topic. It's an important issue in the US, but also, you know, around the world. The United Nations estimates that about 3.5% of the world's population now reside in a country that is not their own. In the US, that number goes up to about 15.1% of the population in the US. Since 2000, over 1 million both legal and illegal immigrants are entering the US annually, about 10 million in a decade. A little bit for reference, in the 1950s, only about 250,000 immigrants entered the US. So, so this might raise concerns that immigrants have negative impacts on the labor market opportunities of native-born workers. This perspective is one that's grounded on the idea that immigrants just take jobs. They, you know, they expand the labor supply. They compete for jobs with native-born workers, and as a result, wages are going to fall. There's more workers going around, and so there's a pressure for wages to go down. Of course, this underpins many of the concerns and policies that might seek to limit immigration. The evidence on this issue is quite robust. Interestingly enough, the results are not very conclusive. These results examine the wage impacts from immigration on the native population. They tend to find small effects. More recent studies, and a very influential study using a very large immigration shock from the Mariel boat lift, the Cuban immigration shock that increased the labor force in Miami by 7% overnight, practically. By contrast, found no impact. So there's been a lot of studies following that that have a hard time finding negative impacts on native populations' outcomes. And then the question is why? Of course, a different narrative is one that is grounded on the idea that immigrants also create jobs. Many immigrants come into the country, but they can become entrepreneurs and they can start jobs. So the work of Sari in this space has already shown us that. So how do entrepreneurs counterbalance the labor supply that comes in? Well, they create jobs and they increase demand for workers. What we do in our paper is that we stack the labor demand effects and the labor supply effects and try to get a sense for what is the net impact from these two forces. And if you get the insight from our work is that if immigrants are disproportionately adept, are disproportionately adept at creating businesses, and these businesses are good businesses, then the number of jobs that they create are going to outweigh the number of jobs that can be filled by the immigrant inflows. The key the key insight then is that if immigrants tend to start more businesses relative to the native population, and these businesses are of equal quality, you might want to think about quality in terms of the size distribution. So if the size distribution of businesses that immigrants start is similar to those that are started by the native population, but there's more of them, right? More businesses being created by these immigrants, then it follows that more jobs are being created that are taken. So what we do in this paper is we do a simple comparison of the size distribution. Here you see in log terms. So on the horizontal axis, you see firm size in logs. On the vertical axis, you see the firm count. This is normalized by the immigrant population, also in a log, on a log scale. What you can see is that immigrants, the immigrant line in blue is right shifted, meaning there are more businesses being created relative to their size in the population by immigrants than there are businesses being created by the native population. So immigrants are extremely entrepreneurial. But what it's important also to recognize in this chart is that they start businesses of all size classes. So they not only create small businesses, but they also create very successful businesses. Of course, we already knew from anecdotal evidence that we have Elon Musk and Sergey Brin. They've created very large companies that have been transformative. What this shows now with administrative data covering all of the businesses, startups in the US, is that indeed, this is not just an anecdotal fact. Immigrants do create more businesses, and they create businesses of all size classes. And you have some numbers there that show you what those rates are. Immigrants are roughly 80% more entrepreneurial. They have a higher entry rate into entrepreneurship relative to the native population. So what is the implication from that? The implication from that is exactly what I was telling earlier. They're going to be creating more jobs than the jobs that are taken by the immigrant inflows. The impact on wages and an average income, therefore, for the native population is going to be positive. So let me stop there. There's a lot to say about how innovative these businesses are as well, and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Dr. Miranda. All three talks were amazing, and some people asked questions about the talk in general. Let me start about like jobs that they create. So I think many people will be curious what kind of jobs are created by immigrants. So all three presenters talked about how immigrants are increasingly create jobs, but I think it would be better, it would be good if we could know better about the quality of job, like or what kind of jobs they are creating. Are there regional dimensions, or is it like tech-based, or is it more like small restaurants or retail shops? Are they paying well? So could you tell us more about the job aspect of immigrant entrepreneurship?
I can start that. So we've there is now data, and we've produced some analysis on the types of jobs that immigrants now generate, and it's interesting. So as I mentioned, they generate jobs broadly for all, but there is a tendency to obviously hire more of your own sort of co-ethnicity. We have found that they depending a little bit on whether you control for all potential differences between the immigrant and native-owned firms. For example, we found that immigrant-owned firms are more likely to be in the service sector, where the pay tends to be lower. So if we don't take that fact into account, we find that the pay is a little bit lower in the immigrant sort of created jobs. But then once you control for everything, the pay difference starts to disappear. They are a little bit less likely to provide benefits to their employees, and so that's something interesting that also we noticed. But so by and large, like I say, they generate all kinds of jobs, not just tech jobs and not just sort of service jobs, and they look relatively comparable. We're not entirely clear why some of the differences in terms of the provision of benefits, for example.
Yeah, and I can add a little bit to that from our perspective. So one of the things that we've done, kind of the results that I showed you were for young firms, up to 5-year-old. We've done a similar analysis for Fortune 500 firms, so looking at the largest firms in the economy, and we've asked a very similar question. We've looked at who started these large firms, and are they disproportionately started by immigrants? And do they have, do they have similar properties in terms of their size distribution? And we find that even for the Fortune 500 firms, these are the largest firms in the economy, that is still the case. So those firms are disproportionately started by immigrants, and these firms are some of the larger firms in the economy. So again, that line that I showed you is also right shifted when focused on the Fortune 500 firms. The other thing that I'll add to these, responding kind of more directly to Haneul's comment on wages, right? So there's possibly this concern that they pay lower wages. So we don't find that to be the case in our data. When we do a regression looking at the wages paid to workers that are employed in businesses that are started by immigrants, we see no negative effect, no penalty to working at an immigrant firm. So there is no evidence that we see that the jobs that they create are lower quality, certainly not in terms of the wages that they pay relative to wages paid in native created firms.
And I'll just quickly jump in to again confirm with what Dr. Kerr had said in terms of my own research on Hispanic immigrant entrepreneurs. That again, they're smaller. They tend to be smaller firms. Many of them, the vast majority, are not employer firms. But among those that are, they tend to employ fewer workers. And there's a disproportionate share in the service sector, but a lot of that reflects the types of industries in which we see Hispanic immigrant entrepreneurs. And in terms of some of the regional effects, Dr. Kerr's presentation with the map of showing, where immigrant entrepreneurs are located, that's a good indication, a good bellwether in terms of thinking about the jobs that are created. They would essentially mirror or parallel the map that she showed. Thank you.
Thank you. It was all great answers. And I have some other questions about immigrant entrepreneurs. So compared to domestic borns, I think they have many different qualities. And I think the barriers they have to face when they make their mind to create a business should be somewhat different compared to their domestic peers. So could you tell us more about potential barriers that immigrant entrepreneurs may face and potential ways that can support immigrant entrepreneurship or Hispanic entrepreneurship?
I can go ahead and jump into that with some of the research that I've done, again, focusing on Hispanic immigrant entrepreneurs. Access to credit is one of the key factors that has served as a barrier. It serves as a barrier for both US born as well as foreign born Hispanic immigrant or Hispanic entrepreneurs, but more so among Hispanic immigrant entrepreneurs. Of interest in terms of data availability is always an issue when you're trying to dig out a little bit deeper in terms of what's happening. We found that a lot of the fear of not getting a loan has seemed to deter these business owners from even applying to begin with. And so when we consider how, in order to be approved for a loan, one needs to first apply for it. But the fear of not getting a loan because of the fear of being denied credit seems to be keeping out more so the immigrant entrepreneurs from accessing credit. Also, when we think about immigrants who are moving to the US, they have a disadvantage relative to their US born counterparts because they have a learning curve in terms of just getting a good understanding of the institutional support that might be out there, the types of lending programs that might be out there, for example, the Small Business Administration, for example. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I can say it's interesting. So we've not looked at we've not disaggregated and looked at differential impacts or effects from Hispanic immigration, for example. But it is very interesting to see in the data that, and it is confirmed over and over again, that immigrants disproportionately start businesses relative to native populations. So while they obviously faced large barriers to starting businesses, they also, they might face barriers more generally, which might push them. It might be one reason why they're more entrepreneurial, right? If they have constraints also accessing labor markets, that might push them to entrepreneurship as a solution, right? As a life choice. What I want to say, kind of one of the insights that comes out of our research is that the fact that, for example, Hispanic businesses might be on average smaller, doesn't mean that the effects on native populations are going to be negative, right? That they're going to be taking more jobs than the jobs that they create, right? Which might be a concern. So there's a lot of immigrants coming in, and the businesses that they create are all small. Then that's going to have a negative impact on the wages of the native population by suppressing wages. All that you need to have, it's okay to create lots of small businesses, it's perfectly fine. What you need to have is that they create a disproportional number of firms of all size classes. So you can have lots of small firms, and they could even be, disproportionately small. We're looking at those created by immigrants, but as long as there's more of them, relatively more of them, of all size classes, the impacts are going to be positive on native populations, and I think that's important to recognize.
Nice. I have a few tiny more things to add. I think adding to Marie's note on the credit constraints, I think there is evidence that they do face more credit constraints, and you can see that in the type of type of funding they use to start and grow their businesses. So they're more likely to use things like home equity loans or family loans or other things that are not sort of formal bank credit. So that seems to be indicative of that. I agree with Javi that the fact that they seem represented in all overrepresented in all size classes seems to say that they might not as credit constrained as we often fear, at least more so than the native owned firms. And then from sort of very small survey work that we've done, I think some of these things are hard to get to in the big administrative data. Immigrants do indicate that they have issues with U.S. bureaucracy, so U.S. Immigration policy that prevents them just as well as the U.S. American-owned businesses from hiring people they might need. So hiring the skilled labor they might need is the same constraint for them. Likewise, some of the bureaucracy in terms of bidding for public contracts that can be quite lucrative. The bidding process can be cumbersome. The bureaucracy and language constraints tends to be sort of, they often cite that. And again, this is just coming from very small survey data, but it's indicative that they do have many constraints relative to policy, bureaucracy, and language.
Thank you for all your great answers. I think we have more questions regarding immigrant-owned firms. Like during this pandemic, do you think immigrant-owned firms are doing well during this pandemic? How they are doing with the pandemic? Do you think they are proportionally having more, having a harder time during pandemic?
So this was something I haven't like done a survey during the pandemic, but just based on looking at the sectors they're in, where if you remember my sort of pie chart, they're in some of the hardest hit sectors. Some sectors are doing still fine, but immigrants were underrepresented, for example, in construction and manufacturing, which are the sectors that seem to be surviving better. They're overrepresented in a lot of those accommodation, food services, and other local services that are doing really badly. So my feeling is that on average, they're having a harder time than the rest of the businesses, and their owners may also not be eligible for all the kinds of supports that exist for business owners and unemployment and all these kinds of things that makes it even harder.
So I think when academics talk about immigrants, I think it is mostly based on visa status. So if they are not born, for instance, in the United States, they are treated as immigrants. And if they are born inside the US, they are considered the US. But I think there is a broader spectrum of foreignness, I guess. So maybe some people came in the US before preschool, but still they could be considered immigrants because they are born outside the US. But some people may, so I think there could be many ways to define immigrants. So if we look inside that spectrum, and for instance, if we weed out those who came to the US before, for instance, higher education or before middle school, do you think it could give different implication to research? And do you think how we define immigrants could give different answers to all the questions that we ask about immigrant entrepreneurship?
Yes, so I think that's a great point. So we've done some work, for example, on second-generation immigrants. You can look at second-generation immigrants and childhood arrivals. They very interestingly fall between native-born Americans and sort of the more adult immigrants who came here as adults. So I think you're right, there's sort of a whole spectrum of foreignness, and the answers do, even in sort of this immigrant entrepreneurship sense, do depend on that.
Yeah, I completely agree with Sari. We're now doing some work looking at a cohort, a recent cohort of immigrants, and looking at their age at time of entry, and that's still work that it's in progress. But some of what we're starting to see is that even for immigrants that come into the country at the age of 18, say, beyond their earlier kind of formative years, we are seeing very, very high similar startup rates or entrepreneurship rates to the general immigrant population, which suggests that a lot of these immigrants are bringing their entrepreneurial ideas from abroad. They have an entrepreneurial mindset. They have skills coming in, and they put them to work, starting businesses.
I think the answers were great. So I think there are so I think we discussed about like barriers that immigrants may face. But can we also talk about strength that immigrant entrepreneurs have compared to their domestic peers? And so if immigrant entrepreneurs have some strength over their domestic peers, I think the type of business immigrants start may be a little bit different from their domestic peers. So for instance, maybe they have barrier in terms of getting access to finances, and they have some like visa complications, but also they may have some unique network or unique cultural like assets based on which they can create an awesome business. So could you tell us more about immigrant entrepreneurs' strengths, and based on which whether the type of business they create is different?
So that's excellent. I like the more positive framing. There are challenges, but there are also many strengths. And I think later today or later in the sessions, you may hear more about sort of the innovativeness of the immigrant businesses versus the native businesses. We've also looked at it with some of the data that we used here, and we do see that immigrant-owned businesses, immigrant-founded businesses, especially the ones that have a high-skilled immigrant as a founder, are more likely to patent. And so there's definitely something, a connection between the entrepreneurship and the innovativeness that seems to be innate in this immigrant pool. And the other thing you mentioned, networks, we've been able to look at, for example, foreign activities. Immigrant-owned businesses are far more likely to export, to have foreign activity, foreign operations, and that is certainly something that helps them sort of grow, expand their base of customers beyond just the U.S. border. So they do have strengths.
Yeah, and I would echo Sari's thoughts and reinforce them. Immigrants do seem to have advantages, some very important advantages, and innovating is one of them. So when we look at our population of startups, again, the universe of startups using the administrative data, just even within those 5 first years after the business is started, we find that out of that population, the immigrant firms, those startups, are 35% more likely to own patents than native created firms. The externalities from that are important as well, right? So if these businesses are indeed more innovative, those innovations get externalized, right? and spill throughout the economy, that only has greater effects and greater positive effects on the native-born population in terms of their standards of living. So kind of want to reinforce from a large, big picture perspective, not only do we think that they contribute more jobs than they take, therefore raising wages, if they're more innovative, the spillover effects are going to have kick in and have additional benefits to the US, to the standards of living here, and to the native populations.
Thank you for all your great answers. I think we got some more questions about data. So some audiences are curious whether there are like anything missing in terms of data on immigrant entrepreneurs, which could potentially hamper our understanding of immigrant entrepreneurs. And some audiences are also curious about the size of the business that are created by entrepreneurs. So could you answer in terms of data, what do we know more about them to have better understanding of them?
So Javi can answer the size and his data wishes. I think for me, I'm very interested in some of the policy related questions on immigration. So looked at, for example, in a large scale survey of the world immigration policies regarding what countries do to try to attract high-skilled immigrants and especially immigrant entrepreneurs. And some countries have very specific schemes. They try to give lucrative visa packages for immigrant entrepreneurs and their families to try to get them to start businesses there and grow their businesses. The US is sort of, I think, rather confused in terms of what they want to do with their immigration policy, and the immigrant entrepreneurship is not any different in that respect. But in order for us to have a deeper understanding of where do these immigrant entrepreneurs come, how do they arrive in the US, what process do they have to go through? So for example, if we think about some of the tech firms that hire a lot of skilled employees under the H-1B visa, it would be very interesting to know, those people might come under that visa initially, maybe they bring their family. How does their life evolve from there? The H-1B visa ties them initially to the firm that they work for, but they may have entrepreneurial ideas and sort of eventually get a green card and then spin off their own businesses. But a lot of that process it's very hard for us to understand because we don't know anything even with all of the great data that we have, we really don't know how people arrived here, what visa they came under. Did they come as students? Did they then get their first job? What kind of a visa did they have? And in order for us to give helpful answers in terms of what we should do to maximize the benefit that we get from immigration, it would be really useful to know something about the types of visa struggles that immigrants face. I think I personally have been under every possible visa in this country before I became a citizen, so I sympathize with all of them.
Yeah, I would completely echo that. It'd be great to get access to those data. Hopefully we'll get that soon. The other thing that would be really useful, and something that Sari mentioned earlier, be useful to know from administrative records so we can do more systematic analysis. Who are the kind of second generation immigrants, right? We think the sons and daughters of immigrants are incredibly entrepreneurial as well. So, when I talked about the disproportionate effects, on the economy, the positive effects of the economy from immigration, we're not even counting second generations, right? So having information about the immigrant status of U.S. citizens, of the parents of U.S. citizens, what are now U.S. citizens, would help us understand even better what those kind of the rich benefits that immigrants provide, not only when they first come in, but through their, through generations afterwards. And maybe just to say about the size, there was a question about the size, just to reiterate, we're not seeing, we have done a little bit of analysis looking at the size distribution of immigrant firms, depending on whether they come from OECD countries. The immigrants come from OECD countries versus non-OECD countries, which might get a sense for, some of kind of the region of origin of the immigrant. And we're not seeing fundamentally different size distributions for immigrant created firms versus native versus firms that are created by native born citizens. So we're not seeing we're not seeing large differences there.
Thank you for your answer. I think this panel informed us a lot about immigrant entrepreneurship in general and the effect on the economy, as well as barriers and weaknesses and strengths of immigrant entrepreneurship. It was very educational panel, and I think we will soon have to transition into panel 2, which will be about why do immigrants start businesses and what does it mean for communities. And Ms. Tara Carr-Lemke from Rutgers University will moderate this panel, and she's a PhD candidate from Rutgers University.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists for your opening presentations and comments. So again, good morning and welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce each of our participants for panel number 2. I'll start off by introducing our 3 panelists, and then each will take turns sharing their reflections on the central question of this panel, which again is, why do immigrants start businesses and what does this mean for communities? Do keep in mind that we will open to Q&A and also comments and questions that panelists might have for one another following their opening remarks. So please do add your questions to the Q&A box as panelists are speaking. So first up, we have Dr. Rob Fairlie who's a professor of economics at the University of California, Santa Cruz, also a member of the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research interests include entrepreneurship, education, information technology, racial and gender inequality, labor economics, and immigration. He's published widely, been a visiting professor at a number of higher ed institutions, and also spoken and testified in front of the US Senate, House of Representatives, Department of Treasury, and California State Assembly. Secondly, we will have Dr. Rajshree Agarwal, who is the Rudolph Lamone Professor of Entrepreneurship and Strategy, and also the Director of the Ed Snyder Center for Enterprise and Markets at the University of Maryland. She studies the evolution of industries, firms, and individual careers as fostered by the twin engines of innovation and enterprise. Her scholarship uses an interdisciplinary lens to provide insights on strategic innovation. She routinely publishes in leading journals, and I think particularly notable is a comment from a leading media outlet who described her work and her as an economist who makes things understandable. And then finally, we have Dr. Tamara Nopper, an assistant professor of sociology at Rhode Island College. Her teaching and research focus on the intersection of economic, racial, and gender inequality, and her publications have examined a variety of issues of note today, including immigrant entrepreneurship and minority business development. Dr. Nopper will be joining us a few minutes late, so we're going to start things off with Dr. Fairlie. So please, Dr. Fairlie.
Great. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I think that, talking about immigrant entrepreneurship, especially in these times, these difficult times for small business, is extremely important. So I want to thank the Kauffman Foundation for taking this initiative on such an important topic. Clearly this is a trying time. It could be the most trying time that small businesses have faced in the last at least 50 years. And so I think it's really important that we think about these issues. And it was great to hear the first panel really set up the issues about immigrant entrepreneurs and their contributions and how valuable they are to the economy. What I want to do is talk a little bit about that also in some of my earlier research, and then talk about what I'm working on right now, which is just focusing on the pandemic and what's happening to immigrant entrepreneurs. So I have a few publications that I'm basing this talk on. One is that I wrote a handbook chapter with Magnus Lofstrom that looked at immigration and entrepreneurship and really gets into some of the issues about, why immigrants are entrepreneurial, what are the contributions they make to the economy. And then I did some work for the Small Business Administration directly estimating the contribution of immigrant business owners, and I'll talk a little bit about those results. And then finally, I'm going to talk about new work of mine that directly estimates the impact of COVID-19 on small business owners, and I will talk about what it's doing to immigrant small business owners. Okay, so starting out with the contributions, we heard a lot about the previous talks. They did an excellent summary of what was going on. Some of the numbers that I've looked at, we see that there are about 2.4 million business owners who are immigrants in the US, and that's about 18.2% of the total of all business owners. And you can see a higher share of all business owners are immigrants, and that's higher than the total workforce. And the business ownership rate among immigrants is higher than it is for native borns. And so this is where I really wanted to focus my attention, though, is there's an incredible amount of heterogeneity in terms of those business ownership rates by the source country. So for example, if you look at Korean immigrants, 23% of Koreans, that's almost a quarter of the labor force, owns a business. That's one of the highest rates. If you look at immigrants from Brazil, extremely high rates, immigrants from Iran, immigrants from Italy also. So you see this incredible range across different parts of the world and among different source countries. And I think that's actually really important, is that there's a lot of heterogeneity, and it's something that we don't discuss as much, but it is obviously very important. And then of course, the gateway states or gateway cities are also important. If you look at just California and you look at the immigrant share of all business owners, it's 37%. That's by far the highest. New York also has high levels, Florida, New Jersey. And then you start to see, even states like Arizona, 20% of all business owners are immigrants. So there's also incredible variation across states in the US. The share of immigrant entrepreneurs is going up. This is a different measure than what you saw on panel one. This is actually a household survey measure that I do work with Sammy Desai, and we do it for the Kauffman indicators, is what is the share of immigrants that are starting up new businesses each month? And that has just consistently gone up over time. And that's to two reasons, right? One is that the share of the population or workforce is going up, but it's also because entrepreneurship rates are going up within the group. Now, let's turn to what I really wanted to kind of focus my talk on, is what's happening now. Again, this is, an unprecedented change in time in the world. And we know that lots of stores, factories, and many other businesses were closed, right? You think back to March when it started, they were closed by policy mandate. There were obviously differences across states. The first real restrictions were put in place at the end of March. They started actually in Santa Clara County, really close to where I live, and California, and then New York State followed the next day. And that shut down lots of small businesses. Now, what's interesting though, is we don't really know all the early effects of COVID-19 on small business and entrepreneurs. Part of the reason is that it's hard to get timely data. So it's hard to get data that are really showing us what just happened. And then another thing is it's hard to get demographic data on owners. And that usually also, there's some delay in getting that information. So what I did is I actually used some household survey data from the current population survey to try to get at this really quickly. And some of the work that I published was published even at like the end of last summer. So what I wanted to know is how large were the early stage impacts on small business owners? And then of course, were there disproportionate effects on immigrant business owners? And so here's the drop. So this shows you business ownership in the US, where the owner is actively running the business at that time. And you can see it's pretty steady. You know, of course, it goes down. It went down in the Great Recession. It went down around 5% over the entire Great Recession. And then you can see that kind of slow upward trend upwards over this strong economic growth period that we had. And then you can see April. I mean, April is so much bigger than the Great Recession than any other time, you know, in you know, at least the data that I have recorded here, and likely a much longer period of time. Now, were there disproportionate impacts on immigrants? Yes. You can see the immigrant rate dropped from February to April of 2020, just a 2-month period, it dropped by 36%. That was much higher than for US born, which was 18%. So there was definitely a disproportionate impact on immigrant business owners. Part of what was driving this appears to be the scale of the businesses. A lot of immigrant business owners are running smaller businesses, and it was more difficult to stay open during this period. If you think of like large franchises like McDonald's or Burger King, they stayed open, right? They just put up big signs that said drive-through open right now, and they were able to continue running. Whereas small kind of restaurants, for example, were, you know, clearly closed down, at least in that first month or two. Okay, now what happened since then? I mean, that's, you know, we're in January now of 2021, and what is happening? It's really interesting because there was the big drop in April in business ownership, and then every month since then, there was a steady increase until that peak that you see in 2020 is October. So what happened is it was going up, 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 up every single month, returning back to normal, you know, the pre-pandemic levels. And then all of a sudden, we've seen a reversal in November and December. Now, it's not entirely clear what happened there. There are a lot of theories about, you know, additional shutdowns or returning to shutdowns. And that we still don't know the answers to, and we probably won't for a little while. How did it compare for immigrant business owners? What we see here on the kind of orange line is, you know, the immigrant business owners, and the blue line there is for the total, you know, national level, the total. And so what you can see is the drop was bigger, as I showed you, the 36% drop. The recovery is similar. You know, there's a little bit difference in November and December, but you can still see like December is down. But what's interesting is if you just kind of focus on this last recovery period, it hides some interesting facts. One is that immigrant business ownership never fully recovered like it did for the national level. So this shows you 3 different ways of measuring it. So I wanted to be incredibly thorough on how we thought about this, to be very careful about it. Basically, one way you can do this is you can compare the number in the current month, say December 2020 to February 2020. That was the last month that was unaffected by the pandemic. Or you can compare it to the year before month. So this would be December 2019, if you're worried about seasonality or monthly differentials. And there is some monthly variation. Or you could do a very careful event study type analysis with a regression model, and you control for seasonality, you control for pre-trends, and you look at where we predicted to be at that point. And you can see that these are pretty consistent, right? Even in October, when we were seeing the US national level pretty much return to normal, immigrant entrepreneurs were still down by 13%, 10%, 10%, depending on the measure. In December, it's even worse, right? I'm showing 13 to 17% levels that are down. If you look at the national average, it's more like 6%. So there's something that we need to understand better, and something that we should worry a lot about is that immigrant businesses are struggling. I believe it's mostly due to the scale of the business. It's also certainly due to the industries that they're in. A lot of immigrant businesses are in very person-to-person type businesses. They are in businesses that have been, you know, shut down for various reasons. Okay, just to kind of conclude, to wrap it up, we saw this large drop in active business owners in April. It was disproportionately affected immigrant business owners. That 36% drop was much higher than the 18% drop we saw for US-born business owners. The rebound happened, but it didn't come all the way back for immigrant business owners. And certainly what we're seeing is not only did it not come back, but it's gotten worse, at least in the last month of 2020. Now, over this entire period, I'm just showing business activity. It's much harder to get sales levels or revenue losses or profit losses. And that's something that we should be extremely worried about. And then finally, as it was mentioned in panel one, immigrant businesses hire other co-ethnics. And so that also could be creating kind of longer term unemployment issues that we need to worry about. Now, with all this said, there are a lot of trade-offs with health, and that is makes all of these issues much more complicated, at least in terms of, when we want to think about policy. So thank you very much.
So thank you again. I heard the lag end of panel one, and also thank you so much, Robert, for your very, very succinct presentation of the state of immigrant business owners and the pandemic's effects on them. The theme of today's second panel is on why do immigrants engage in entrepreneurship? And of course, how does that impact their communities? And I'm going to be focusing on research that has been supported by the Kauffman Foundation. Thank you very much. Using NSF CSTAT data to examine a particular fraction of the immigrant population, especially the STEM workforce aspect. So this is work that is joined with Martin Genko and Joe Raffi at the University of Southern California. So one of the things that, of course, the theme of this panel is why do we engage, why engage in entrepreneurship to begin with? And so even before we talk about immigrants and what are their reasons to engage in entrepreneurship, generally speaking, there's a rich literature stream that says, well, you engage in entrepreneurship for two reasons. One, you have preferences for entrepreneurship. So you just naturally want to sort into creating new businesses or joining startup activity. And then, of course, the second reason is that you have relevant skills or human capital that can be leveraged. And it may very well be that sometimes that can be better leveraged by starting new firms as opposed to working in existing organizations. So throughout this presentation, what I'll be doing for you is comparing the native population and the immigrant population in terms of their choices of whether to stay at work with established organizations or to venture out on their own. Now, critically in this context is the relationship of job education match as it relates to this acquisition of relevant skills and human capital. And the literature also talks about the fact that job education match typically increases the specialization of human capital, precisely because if you think about the two dimensions of human capital that we measure, it's largely education as well as job experience. So the more you have a higher job education match, the more specialized you are in terms of creating these the skills that you might need, and then you may leverage it either in established organizations or starting a new firm. Now, typically in the native population, at least, the literature has examined the fact that these two aspects relate to entrepreneurship, but the more you have job education match, the less likely you are to engage in entrepreneurship. And also preferences for entrepreneurship will allow you to go into starting new firms rather than working at established organizations. Now, what happens with immigrants, especially those that we're looking at based on this NSF data, we're going to be focusing on that slice of the population that come to the United States to enter for education first and foremost. And so most of these immigrants come in on an F1 visa, and then post graduation, they apply for OPT, optional practical training, and then also H-1B visas. So the constraints that both OPT and the H-1B requirements put in is, of course, they're not allowed under current rules to necessarily engage in entrepreneurship, right? You might have some workarounds in as much as your co-founder may be a native, and then they may sponsor you for an H-1B in your new startup, but that really happens on a very minuscule level. So early career people who want to engage in entrepreneurship right after they graduate, they find themselves not able to engage in entrepreneurship. More importantly, they also increase the likelihood of early career job education match sorting. So precisely because the OPT requires you to get experience in the area of your education, these immigrants, because of these constraints, end up not being able to, so generally speaking, people with individuals with preferences for entrepreneurship at graduation, particularly in the native population, they tend to go into entrepreneurship itself and not sort into a high job education match because they might pursue opportunities that aren't necessarily related to their education itself. Immigrants are not allowed to do so. So having immigration constraints implies that this relationship between my preferences for entrepreneurship and sorting into a job education match relative to a native is weakened. Now, what we also find that among those with job education match, now this is using the CSTAT data that I had talked about before. This is a National Science Foundation survey. And we examined data from 2003 to 2013 as 5 days of longitudinal survey. We're doing both cross-sectional and panel data analysis on a final sample of about almost 30,000 individuals that graduate from US universities and then continue to be in the workforce or engage in entrepreneurship in the United States. So what is particularly striking here, that among those who have job education match, and of course, keep in mind that immigrants are going to be disproportionately sorted into this area, immigrants report both lower job satisfaction relative to natives and earn less. Keep in mind that they're not also allowed to engage in entrepreneurship. Now, when these immigration constraints are lifted, either because they've finally gotten their green card or citizenship, you end up seeing that most of these immigrants now have high job education match. Now, for the native population, generally speaking, because of the increase in specialization of human capital and also the increase in opportunity costs, because they're making higher wages, they tend to have lower levels of both unintended.
So my understanding is that we may be frozen, or at least our current speaker may be frozen. I hope that others are still with us. So we will see, oh good, okay. So it looks like only our one speaker is frozen. Hopefully she'll be able to return to us in a moment. But we do have a few questions that we can begin our conversation with as we see if we can sort out this technical issue. So Dr. Fairlie, it's all you. There was one specific question about your data, what your data sources are in terms of the graphs you were showing us with regard to business ownership.
Yeah, so I answered that question, but I'm not sure, if it showed up or not. Basically, I have a paper that I posted on the PowerPoint, but it's also on my webpage. And I provided a link to where I'm trying to keep those data updated. There's also a lot more information there. I'm not only looking at immigrants, but I'm looking at other demographic characteristics. For example, I'm looking at women and men. And then of course, I'm looking at every kind of major ethnic and racial group in the US. So all that data is there also.
Thank you so much. I did not see that, but perhaps others had access. I think we are now able to welcome our third panelist who's with us now, Dr. Nopper. We'd invite you to share your thoughts on the theme of the panel today.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm good to go. I want to thank Sammy and Tara and everybody at Kauffman who organized this, and it's great to join you all. I was just finishing up my class, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. So a lot of stuff that's very relevant to this conversation. So one of the things is that I'm interested in terms of the sociology of entrepreneurship and immigrant entrepreneurship and thinking about the connections between race and ethnicity and globalization. And this is something that when I was, in grad school decades ago, a professor of mine said, if you don't kind of really take globalization seriously in your study of racism, you're going to kind of, lack some understanding of some things. And so my research has on Korean immigrant entrepreneurship has been part of that. So I originally started doing research on Korean immigrants actually my sophomore year in college. I wrote my first paper on Black Korean conflict, just trying to understand some of the stuff I was seeing in pop culture. And it was not too long after the LA Rebellion in 1992. So over the years, I was still doing a lot of research on that, but I was primarily interested in kind of race relations between groups and about kind of what some people would argue is mutual misunderstanding. In that literature on Black Korean conflict in terms of Korean immigrant store owners in Black neighborhoods, you often saw this argument or these questions about, how did Koreans open up these stores? And how did Korean immigrants open up these businesses fairly quickly after the 1965 Immigration Act in terms of kind of establishing themselves in certain neighborhoods and so forth. There was also this question about why are they overrepresented in certain neighborhoods, particularly Black working class and poor neighborhoods. And what you often saw in the literature was this argument that Korean immigrants are disadvantaged. Meaning that it was argued that because they are immigrants and of color, that they did not have access to the primary labor market and that they were disadvantaged and they had to kind of go into small business as a response to this disadvantage. You also saw this question, consistently, this question about, well, how did they open up these businesses? Where did they get this money from? Right. And this was a question that you saw not only in the scholarship on Korean immigrant entrepreneurs, but it was also a question that I encountered quite a lot in different Black community spaces. And so I started to really kind of see this connection between what was going on in the scholarship, but also conversations I would encounter at these community forums. Sometimes if I was listening to kind of Black radio stations, Black talk radio stations, or if I was participating as a panelist, right? Was this kind of question about, well, how are they opening up these businesses? Where are they getting this money from? And in the literature, what you often saw was people talking about Koreans kind of pooling their resources, right? Whether it was through this idea of rotating credit associations like key clubs, or kind of using their networks with each other to try to, kind of work out special deals between each other for someone to acquire a store or not. And so I became kind of, very steeped in that literature. And I actually used to very much embrace that literature in the sense that I would kind of repeat those talking points. But over time, my focus started to become interested in the role of Korean banks. And so this was a story I shared on the panel that I was on with Sammy a couple weeks ago. But I would go up to New York City. I lived in Philadelphia for years because I went to graduate school at Temple University. And I would go up to New York City a lot. And sometimes I'd go do spoken word, right? There's a reason why I don't do poetry anymore. I was a terrible poet. But I go to the spoken word event at this Asian American Writers Workshop. And it was based in Koreatown in Midtown Manhattan. So in Midtown Manhattan, that's where you had all these kind of Korean banks. And I would be like, okay, I'm seeing these Korean banks, but it doesn't get talked a lot about in the literature. The literature tells us that Koreans don't really get access to banking, or that they don't get access to government resources, and that this is also part of their disadvantage. And this is supposedly why they only kind of rely on each other to pool resources. And so as I'm going to try to, test out my skills as a poet, right? And of course I failed, right? I'm, seeing these Korean banks in Midtown Manhattan, and I'm like, okay, well, I don't see a lot of this in the literature, right? But I also saw on these Korean banks, it would say SBA lender, Small Business Administration lender. So I became interested in kind of studying more the role of Korean banks and the role of the SBA. And in the process, I got introduced to and recommended to talk with people who work for other federal government agencies, such as the Minority Business Development Agency, but also the Asian American Pacific Islander White House Commission, the FDIC, right? And I started to kind of, and so I did a study for my dissertation of Korean banking and federal government resources in Los Angeles and New York City, which are the two largest hubs of Korean immigrants, as well as Korean banking and Korean immigrant entrepreneurship. And my research really challenged this assumption about Korean immigrant disadvantage. It wasn't to say that they weren't disadvantaged as immigrants or in terms of discrimination, but it was to also amplify that they had developed quite an infrastructure in terms of access to capital through Korean banks. It was also, it challenged my idea of disadvantage because what I found was that sometimes the Korean banks that had global connections, meaning foreign-owned banks that were based in Korea but had subsidiaries in the United States, they sometimes were able to offer things to their clients that Korean American banks that had been established in the United States could not offer. So years ago, you know, things like collateralizing property in Korea, using kind of your history of rental and kind of payment history in Korea and using that as kind of your profile when they're kind of deciding whether to give you a loan or not. And so what that did was it challenged both my understanding of kind of disadvantage. One, they were using all these resources from banks, but two, it put into focus kind of the impact of globalization and how that can shape different kind of resourcing that one, different waves of immigrants can get, but also different nationalities or ethnicity groups can get, right? So I had to think about things like the US and South Korea's very strong diplomatic ties, right? Partly because of the violent history of the Korean War, which is, you know, a war that still has not officially ended, right? But I had to think about, you know, that creates kind of a different relationship between the US and South Korea that allows for the development of the globalization and establishment of kind of Korean ethnic banking in the United States, right? I also had to think about things like Koreatowns differently. So Koreatowns, you know, historically, and I teach a lot of Asian American studies classes, you know, when they talk about ethnic enclaves, they're often talked about as kind of sites of where people come together to protect themselves from discrimination. But, you know, these ethnic enclaves have often been sites of commerce, banking, and kind of, you know, different economic and capitalist conflict. And so it meant looking at literature that was related to the sociology of immigrant entrepreneurship, but going to some of the stuff regarding kind of globalization and urbanization, things like the globalization of finance and banking. And so I started to kind of piece together a bigger portrait for myself. In that process, it meant challenging long-standing beliefs of kind of immigrant disadvantage and having a more complicated view of what it meant for them to kind of use these resources. And that even as they were relying a lot on Korean banks, these Korean banks are not just kind of an ethnic resource between individuals. These are things that have to be regulated, the state has to permit, it has to be related to kind of diplomatic relations and all these different kind of institutional and state processes. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we might begin with some
Tara, I'm back. May I just finish up? I apologize. I mean, so sorry, Tamara, really appreciated listening to the lag end of your presentation too. But where I was before I lost connection was I was towards the end of my slides. And basically, you know, what I was hoping to show you is that among those with job education match, we do see that immigrants are much, much more likely to engage in high growth entrepreneurship than relative to natives. And so what does that really mean for policy purposes? On the one hand, you might say, well, the results can be interpreted as a positive way, in as much as these immigration constraints are causing immigrants to sort into job education match. They're acquiring specialized skills, and they're engaging in high growth entrepreneurship later in their career for the benefit of the communities that they're in. But one of the things that we're concerned about, of course, is this very systematic finding that immigration constraints do suppress early career entrepreneurship. And consistent with data and work by other people, extensive delays in getting green cards often causes immigrants to leave for other countries or where they can get some lucrative jobs as well. And we've already shown you the results of reduced benefits in terms of both job education match and in terms of both salary and job satisfaction. And the biggest issue, of course, that we need to worry about for the continued dynamism of the United States and all of the communities within which they are is that these longer wait times can create delays in high growth incorporated entrepreneurship itself. So what we're hoping to show is the picture of how in high-tech jobs with the STEM workforce, you end up seeing that there is this movement shift away from entrepreneurship because of immigration constraints. So we need to be very, very careful about how our policies balance the benefits of acquiring specialized human capital against all of the negatives associated with delays in creating high growth entrepreneurship. Thank you.
Well, thanks again to all three, and thanks for participants out there who have been flexible with some of the tech issues too. So a number of interesting questions have come in from audience members, and I think we'll start with this one. We know that family and household factors matter quite a bit in how people navigate the process of becoming business owners. Are there family and household factors that are particularly shaped by immigration that matter? So I will open that to any of our panelists.
So I can take this on not based on the research that I have just presented, but generally speaking in terms of both push and pull factors that are family related. There is a particular study by a faculty member at University of Michigan who has been looking at push and pull factors for immigrant entrepreneurship. And one of the things that you do see, especially when you compare first and second generation immigrants, is that you do tend to see a lowering of the push factors that cause second generation immigrants to go into entrepreneurship. While there is significant heterogeneity, of course, in terms of all of the pull factors that continue to encourage people to go into entrepreneurship. So, you know, to the extent that you can get differences between first and second generation, there's data to support that.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that a little bit, one of the things that I've studied in the past is looking at family business experience. So if you have parents that ran a business, you are much more likely, you know, I mean, some of the numbers are almost twice as likely to own a business yourself than if you didn't have a parent that was a business owner. And that's also definitely one of the factors, is that if, you know, immigrants coming from countries where they own businesses, then their children are more likely to own businesses in the US. But there is this sort of like second generation effect that you see across a lot of different groups, where the second generation actually in many cases has lower rates overall of business ownership in the US than the previous generation. So these sort of like two factors that in some sense kind of offset each other. I don't know if they offset each other, but they certainly have, you know, different impacts.
The panelists really, through your presentations, really exposed us to the vast variety and heterogeneity of immigrants around the United States, across the United States, in terms of countries of origin, education levels, ethnic backgrounds, communities, resources, et cetera. And so another question that's come in gets at parts of this. Immigrants are very diverse. How do we understand how things like having access to resources, transnational banking relationships affect them? We know that immigrants may face some unique disadvantages and advantages. And then the question is, how can policymakers start to understand what these may be when we know that immigrants are quite diverse? Again, anyone in the panel.
So I can go with this. I mean, one of the things I would say is that I think this is an important question because when we talk about diversity, we want to think about, some of the things I was emphasizing, but the globalization of banking, that doesn't happen everywhere, and everybody doesn't have an ethnic enclave. And one of the things that was interesting when I was doing interviews with people from the SBA and the MBDC is they talked about their different approach to kind of trying to network with immigrant groups. So they all said, oh, we're trying to, reach out to different communities and so forth. And they're very aware that they're in LA or New York City and that these are very racially diverse and ethnically diverse cities. But they said what we do is, this was their strategy at the time, is they said, we try to connect with neighborhoods where there's kind of concentrations of businesses and of banking. And so what happened is that you had, let's say, in LA, because Koreatown is so developed, right, as a kind of just as a transnational hub, and that was something definitely after the LA rebellion, you just saw influxes of like, Korean capital and so forth, but you also saw the development of a lot of Korean banking in there. And so I, interviewed people who worked with the FDIC, and they had this whole kind of Koreatown development kind of thing. And I got to see the notes of who was at these meetings, and it was a lot of the bankers and people. And it was understood that, if you're kind of working in that area, you're going to take people a lot of times to these Korean banks, right? Even if they weren't Korean, right? And it had to do with kind of who has an established hub of banking, where are they located? Are they kind of concentrated in different spaces? And so things that we might see as kind of examples of only disadvantage, being kind of quote unquote ghettoized an ethnic enclave, it actually became this hub for like how government resources were like, we're going to kind of work with them. Well, you have to explain some of that. How did these influxes of capital come in, right? You can't just send money, right? That's you have to have diplomatic relations. But also, I used to work as an international business consultant for small firms that went, that had global operations, right? So a lot of immigrant entrepreneurs, they do exporting and importing. They import goods from other countries to sell in retail or wholesale in the United States, right? And you have different ethnic groups where that's kind of, some of the major niches they're in is doing wholesale. Well, you have to have, it's a very intense process to find somebody that, you can trust in another country to send you goods and things like letters of credit internationally through these banks. So a lot of, immigrants are sometimes discriminated against from like a major bank like Bank of America or something, but a lot of these banks were starting to try, even the bigger banks were trying to get into that immigrant market. But that's where like these ethnic banks kind of, they flourished a lot in terms of letters of credit. And that was one of their specialties, was doing, import export type of stuff, right? Well, one of the things I had to do when I was doing this international business consulting is I had to do entry strategies for different companies. And part of it would be saying what banks are available there. And, somebody who is from a country that has also an established kind of banking relationship and globalized banking relationships with the US, that benefits them, right? That means that legal departments and letters of credit are there. But also some of these entrepreneurs, they're literally traveling back and forth to countries, to the factories, or to, get the goods to kind of bring back. Everybody doesn't have that type of capital. So if you look at, let's say, for example, different Asian immigrants, like Cambodian donut shops, right? Which I just remember giving a presentation once. Somebody was like, what's a Cambodian donut? I was like, it's just donuts made by a Cambodian person at a store, right? But there's reasons why within the Asian communities, some people are going to do maybe more labor intensive kind of, making sandwiches or doing nail tech, right? Or, selling donuts, and that's kind of their niche, right? Versus who's doing, wholesale and has kind of, like in Koreatown, Midtown Manhattan, it's not just banking, it's a whole bunch of the wholesalers, right? And the Korean business class of wholesalers, right? So that's going to, that plays a role as well. And I think those are some of the global factors that, when we say globalization, it's like breaking it down to kind of, these diplomatic relationships, state ties, who has access to capital, who can travel, who can, has these hubs and so forth, right?
I wonder if thank you so much. I wonder if either Dr. Agarwal or Dr. Fairlie also have comments on this issue of immigrant diversity and policymakers, recognizing that there'll be a roundtable in a few minutes too with regard to some of these issues.
So at least in the context of high-tech workforce, one of the first and obvious ways in which this diversity matters is that even though de facto, because of country-level quotas in H-1B visas, and the way that the green cards can be received, what you end up having is that these constraints are felt by the immigrants from some countries much, much more than others. Mm-hmm. So you may have a certain, so you may have this job education match, you're applying for a green card. In some countries, you'll immediately get your green card because there are very low waiting lines. But in countries from China, from India, from a lot of the Asian countries, there are like waiting lines for 10, 15, 30 years, right? I mean, there was this executive MBA executive in my class, and I was talking about some of this immigration research, and he says, I have been in this country for 18 years, and I think that I have a better chance of getting a green card once my son, who's 12 years old, becomes old enough to sponsor me than I do in my work process, green card process, right? So you tend to see that this, even though there seems to be no obvious differentiation or discrimination of people from different countries and diverse ethnicities, de facto, it ends up being that way.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for perhaps one or two more questions. So, so one question that's also come in is around the fear of discrimination, and I think in some ways this connects to our last panel as well. And the question is the fear of discrimination, quote unquote, justified? Do we have a sense of the degree of discrimination among, particularly this question is looking at Hispanic Americans, but also other racial and ethnic minorities when it comes to opening businesses and entrepreneurship at large?
Yeah, I mean, I could start with this. There's certainly a lot of research showing that there's lending discrimination, right? There are a lot of minority-owned businesses, African-American and Latinx-owned businesses that go into banks or they're dissuaded from going to banks because of, discrimination or perceived discrimination. And so there's a fair amount of literature on that. And that certainly creates a lot of barriers in terms of not being able to get the capital. The other thing that happens, I believe, is there's labor market discrimination that works the other way, right? If you can't get a job in a wage and salary occupation, then often what happens is you see immigrants start up businesses. And so in that sense, those are more like necessity businesses or businesses that are created out of limited labor market opportunities. And that kind of goes back to panel one, where they were talking about, I think a couple of the speakers even were talking about this wide range, right? That there are these really high level, high-tech businesses owned by immigrants that are very successful, but there are also a lot of other ones. It's almost like there's kind of like this, two groups in the distribution kind of argument. So certainly there's a fair amount of evidence of discrimination in a lot of different ways.
And I would add to that, along with what Dr. Fairlie was saying, when we think about the bank lending stuff, I think what's important too is that immigrants can get kind of competing messages regarding things like documentation. And so you have some banks that will allow you to open up accounts with things like cards that are consulate cards, right? There's been all this kind of work to try to allow immigrants to use consular cards and have them officially recognized by financial institutions and so forth as some type of documentation, or you can have an ITIN number or something like that. And so you can have these kind of competing ways where on one hand, if you don't have certain forms of legal documentation, you're being given these messages that there are these official ways that you can get that to kind of work with these institutions. But yet some of these institutions can also sometimes use that, or can be something where there might, like when Bank of America, and there was these, surveys they were sending about people's citizenship status fairly recently, right? Then it becomes also, what fear do you have about maybe reporting stuff about yourself right? And your vulnerability then to, you know, certain forms of immigration enforcement. And this is not to say that all immigrants are here undocumented or so forth, but research shows that most immigrants who are undocumented legally entered the country, but they overstayed their visas and so forth. So you get all these kind of competing things regarding different levels of the state and regulators kind of saying, this is okay, but da 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 da. And it could end up kind of sometimes making you vulnerable with some of these institutions that you're seeking out resources from. And so I think that's also something that policymakers have to think about too.
So in the high-tech workforce, where, you know, as Dr. Nopper and Dr. Fairlie were saying, that, you know, you can say that these are very successful ones, they're creating high-growth entrepreneurship ones too. The data that I just presented, you know, on the one hand, you could make a statistical discrimination argument that, in fact, particularly because if immigrants who come into this country, because of cultural differences, because of soft skill business skills that they may lack and stuff, maybe they're not as successful. So I think that there's a lot of research that still needs to be done to unpack what factors would cause the lower job satisfaction, the lower salaries that I just showed you in the slide set when I created. How much of that is really because of legitimate differences in skill sets, soft and hard skill, and how much of it is because of, you know, reasons why you might say that you're going to privilege some versus others in terms of the job market. Of course, one of the things that we are seeing is that the immigrants that do engage may feel that job market in established firms is not necessarily as conducive to them. This is where post-immigration constraint release, you do see them exercising the option to go into entrepreneurship and then create startups where they can create the environment and thrive, which is also one of the reasons why I'm concerned about the fact that we haven't necessarily paid attention to how immigration constraints affects the entire life cycle of individuals' careers. And at what point in time, what forces, either because of skill of discrimination or because of differences in the way that the demand is for your skills and your capabilities is manifesting itself.
And I think, you know, I just want to kind of loop back to Dr. Fairlie and something also Dr. Agarwal was saying. So when Dr. Fairlie was saying a little bit ago that the data shows that a lot of times, like, you know, second generation, you know, don't tend to go into businesses, right? But there's also, one of the things is that, you know, it was often kind of assumed that the immigrant kind of comes in, does all this hard work and going through the business, so that way their child doesn't have to go into business and that they can kind of get a college education and so forth. As we know, the job market and just kind of jobs, right? And the availability of jobs that people associated with earning a college degree, that has shifted in many ways. And so there's also a lot of, you know, and this is mainly anecdotal, but I don't see it a lot in the literature. But when I was in Philly, like, there was a lot of businesses that would be opened by 1.5 generation Asian immigrants. You know, 1.5 is for people who came into the country, let's say, is maybe like junior high or like high school or college level. So they had a significant amount of socializing and cultural experiences in their home country, but then they have a significant amount of kind of those experiences here. So you'd have all these businesses, and some of them were kind of hipster businesses, but it'd be like 1.5 generation or second generation Asian Americans. And some of them were college educated, some of them weren't. And they tended to open up very different businesses, like no shade, but it wasn't kind of like the small hole in the wall, which I love. I love Korean food, you know, and small hole in the wall type of places, but it'd be like IKEA furniture and they would have like different ideas of cultural norms regarding customer service, and they would hire a multiracial group of people, right? And so some of them had seemed to kind of learn from some of the kind of critiques that had been raised of like their parents' generation of how to run businesses. But that isn't actually kind of in the literature. And I think this goes to something with Dr. Agarwal's stuff is, you know, when we're thinking about kind of high tech, but we're also just thinking about the way a lot of younger people are trying to become entrepreneurs by creating apps or using technology and so forth, right? Like, I think there's a lot of rich research about what do the children of immigrants or second or third generation of immigrant entrepreneurs, what might be the routes in relationship to entrepreneurship that they're taking. And it might not just be replicating kind of, either the trajectory that people assumed of going into college and getting a job in the primary labor market, or it might not be just replicating a business like their parents, right? And so even kind of what types of businesses they have also are shifting.
So perhaps in that way, the word of this panel perhaps could be heterogeneity, right? We've seen a vast diversity in terms of the kinds of people we're talking about, and the rich variety of experiences people are bringing through their quote unquote immigrant experience. And so perhaps that's a nice segue to our final piece here for the day, which is a roundtable entitled Policy Priorities and Interventions in Entrepreneurship Support of Immigrant Entrepreneurs. But before we move there, just a warm and heartfelt thank you, gratitude to our three panelists. We didn't get through all of the questions. I know that there are still some in the Q&A, and so I would invite the panelists, if you have a moment, to take a look at those before we close up. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our next space, and that's Dr. Sami Desai, who's the Director of Research, Entrepreneurship, of course, from the Ewing Kauffman Foundation. So, Sami, Dr. Desai.
Thanks, Tara, and thank you to our previous two panels for their insight. Really excited for this roundtable. We have a mix of folks that are deeply embedded in the research as well as in the practice. And we have 5 panelists today for the roundtable. We have Ms. Nadia Kasvin, who is the co-founder and director of Us Together, which is based in Ohio. We have Dr. William Kerr, who is a professor of business administration at Harvard University. We have Dr. Valerie Lacarte, policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute, Mr. Denzil Mohammed, director of the Public Education Institute at the Immigrant Learning Center. And then we have Dr. Vasco Yasenov, a data scientist at the Immigration Policy Lab at Stanford University. And so with this roundtable, what we really want to do is foster discussion across several topics. And so what I've asked is for each one of our speakers to share a few minutes of insight and some of the key things that they feel are important, and then we'll open it up for some structured discussion and take some Q&A. And so I'm going to go in alphabetical order here and ask Ms. Kasvin to start us off.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to be at this forum. So several words about our organization, Us Together. Us Together is a statewide organization, and we provide integration services to refugees and immigrants. What's unique about our organization is that we founded our organization 17 years ago, and it was co-founded by former refugees that continue to play an active role in managing this organization. And so my personal experiences and majority of clients that we serve are refugees. And so I will concentrate my remarks on that because that's where my expertise is. And so when we hear about refugee success, the stories are sometimes told as though it's a 1 in a million chance, like a story of Sergey Brin, who came as a child as a refugee and then later on went on co-founding Google. But our work in refugee resettlement and refugee integration is a living proof that refugee success is not the exception, it's the norm. Refugees are resilient, hardworking, and the numbers reflect this fact. In December 2015, we published a report on impact of refugees in Central Ohio. And Central Ohio is basically Columbus metropolitan area and surrounding counties. And among other things, what we learned that did come as a surprise to us practitioners in the field working with refugee populations. But what we learned is that 13.6% of refugees went on to own their own businesses. And this is more than a double of the rate of entrepreneurship in the general local population, which is in Columbus, 6.5%. In Columbus, refugees own an estimated 873 businesses, employing about 4,000 workers and supporting more than 21,000 jobs. So that was not a surprise to us. But at that time, the goal of our report was to build an economic case for refugee resettlement. At the time, remember, the end of 2015, at the time when we started losing bipartisan support that we've enjoyed for decades. And so as part of a network of refugee service providers, I definitely would like to know that as we're talking about refugee businesses' success, then we should not underestimate the role of local nonprofit organizations in supporting refugees as they are starting their businesses. For example, we are now in our fourth year of running a microenterprise development program in our Cleveland office. And we meet amazing people and we cheer them on as they embark on this journey, on this adventure with providing anything from training to technical support to access to both credit and business capital, business loans. So I want to stop here and I'm looking forward to conversation.
Thank you. And I think our next up we have Dr. Kerr.
Thank you very much. And thanks so much for putting together this very timely forum and panel conversation. I think with building upon Rob Fairlie's earlier comments, we have a big role, a big job ahead of us in terms of rebuilding the economy and creating a stronger business foundation. And let's try to think about how immigrant entrepreneurs can play a role in that process. What I'd like to do with my comments is maybe integrate a few of the things that were part of the earlier panel with some of the connective glue that I try to think about in this process. And so at a big picture level, one of the starting things that we've learned a lot about is the heterogeneity of immigrant entrepreneurs. And that was a place that we ended the last panel. And you can have several mental models in mind. And as we maybe move into the conversation next, we'll talk about different ways of trying to reach these mental models. But one mental model could be like the Elon Musk of the world, someone that's this, very high profile entrepreneur, maybe backed by large amounts of venture capital. How are we able to attract that individual? And one of the things we have known for a while, and we've been able to further confirm with work like Javier's that was on the business size distribution in the first panel, is that immigrants are disproportionately part of that outer tail of very, very top outcomes and talent. That's true in scientific circles and journal publications and similar types of impacts like the Nobel Prize. We also find it in the immigrant entrepreneurship space. But then there's this second part, which is through the broad distribution. And if we have a quarter of today's entrepreneurs being immigrants, it becomes a lot more about how is that process playing out? And what are some of the things that we've learned about the MBA student that's graduating, or the undergrad, or someone that doesn't even have a high school diploma, and how they are starting their businesses. I think we've learned a lot over the last decade about the ways that sometimes the education, both attainment and also fields of study of immigrants, make them more likely to select into innovative related fields and into business startups and similar. And now we're starting to be able to think more then about what are some of the levers that impact the numbers of people and their impact on other businesses in America as we start to think about some of that, some of those quality distributions. A second thing that I'd like to just highlight at the beginning is we as economists spend a lot of time thinking about, all the workarounds that, can happen with respect to policy. And Rajshree was describing the ways people are trying to contort themselves through F visas and OPT visas and other kind of pathways in order to be able to start their business. This is a big challenge in our immigration system. It hasn't been quite labeled this way yet, but we have a system that has been historically built around employer firms sponsoring people for visas, just like universities are sponsoring students. And that can work reasonably well. It has its challenges that we could dive into. If you're Microsoft and you're staffing up one of your operations, it's challenged a lot when we talk about being able to create your own business, your own startup company. And this is an area that the Kauffman Foundation has worked a lot on over the years. Even in 2013, there was a report that was trying to catalog what would be the impact of an immigrant entrepreneur visa that could that was being thought through at that time. And it was even at the lower bound estimate was 500,000 jobs that would emerge over the next 10 years. And some of the upper bound estimates were even higher. And so as we think about this sort of new administration and kind of a window of opportunity, perhaps to really work on immigrant issues, the immigrant entrepreneur visa seems to be something that has a lot of support. Both sides of the aisle have been supportive of it. And that could be a way for us to sort of make some first progress on being able to tackle some of those issues. And I kind of make as my last sort of opening thought. So we've talked about the size of the impact, and we've also talked about some potential policy tweaks that or reforms that could go around it. I think one of the biggest things that I would want to convey to a policymaker as they think about entrepreneurship related activities is to recognize that entrepreneurship it's really a kind of investment. Like if you're choosing to build a business, open up a business in America, you're making a long-term investment, not so dissimilar for someone buying a house or developing a new chemical plant if you're a bigger company. It is something where the sort of the uncertainty that lies ahead or the assurances that you can have about a stable policy environment are very important because you're making a very long-term commitment to be running your business in that space. And as we think not only just about the policies and reforms that we might make to it, but also are there ways that we can provide immigrants greater assurance about the policy future of the United States, the stability for that? I think that would be very encouraging for gaining even more immigrant entrepreneurship. Thanks. You're on mute, Nadia. Sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kerr. Dr. Lacarte, you are up next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And we have so many great speakers. So what I'll do is I'll keep my first remarks brief, and then some of the questions, some of the other information will come up likely during the discussion. I think there are two areas I'd like to address. One is the interest in research. So what are some of the research questions that we could potentially pursue, but also in terms of areas of intervention for immigrant entrepreneurs. On the research side, there are some interesting data points. A lot of it has been presented and discussed earlier, especially by Dr. Fairlie, who is a guru of data in this area, as we know. So I won't go too much into it, but I do think that to me, one of the important aspects is to understand the relationship between the experience of certain groups in particular on the wage, when it comes to the wage market, the wage work, and then how that translates into entrepreneurship. So is there a push, right, from the labor market? Are there groups that are not, that are starting businesses because of unsatisfactory conditions on the labor market? This was mentioned earlier by Dr. Miranda and Dr. Fairlie as well. I think that when we look at some of the data on entrepreneurship and the rate of foreign-born population, so I should actually share here at least one of my slides so you can see. If we look at the data on the share of businesses that are owned by race and ethnicity, so these are all business owners, it's from the annual business survey. Within racial and ethnic groups, you can see that for most groups, the rate of entrepreneurs, or the percentage of entrepreneurs that are US born is higher, except notably for within Asians, where 84% of the Asian business owners are foreign born, and the Latinos as well, where the foreign born percentage is higher than the US born percentage. This is business owners once again. So these are two groups that stand out that we'll probably talk about later. And we also have, when we're looking at self-employment, so this is a bit different than looking at business owners. But earlier in the discussion, there was this question of whether it would be interesting if we could look at motivations for creating businesses based on immigration status. Well, at the Migration Policy Institute, we have a special data set where we do have estimates on populations based on immigration status beyond just non-citizens that we typically find. So we can identify the naturalized, the green card holders, legal non-immigrants, I'll come back to this, and the unauthorized population. So here what you see is the share of self-employed, and it does show that you know, for most immigration categories, the percentage of self-employed is higher than in the US born population. The legal non-immigrant category is composed of people who are like, you know, who are in maybe H-1B visas, international students. And so the results you're seeing here is related to what someone said earlier. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting who it was, but it was Dr. Agarwal, right? About people who are very qualified and who have legal limitations as to when it comes to creating businesses. So that's what we're seeing here. The other point I wanted to make is when it comes to refugees, in our database, we also have the ability of estimating refugees. And here, this is people who entered as refugees, but they may have changed status since then. In fact, of course, they can hold different statuses, including naturalized citizens. But the data shows that, especially for refugee men, the propensity to be self-employed is much higher than in the US born population. And I'd note that that 15% that we obtain in our estimates is close to what Ms. Kasvin mentioned earlier of 13.1%. I want to just, because I know there's a lot more in data that I could say, but I don't want to get too much into it. I'd like to get to the policy areas of intervention. I do think that when it comes to immigrant entrepreneurs, a lot of the policies that would benefit communities, low-income communities at large in the population would of course benefit them as well, and communities of color. So three areas I'd like to mention. One is the policies that seek to address the racial and ethnic wealth gaps. Why? Well, we know in the literature that there is a connection, a relationship between links between home values, household wealth, disposable income, access to bank loans, as been mentioned, access to credit, and then that of course is linked to startup capital and working capital. And so these relationships and all the policies that seek to level the playing field would of course benefit immigrant workers, immigrant entrepreneurs, and especially immigrant entrepreneurs of color. I would note, as it was mentioned earlier, I believe, is that when you look at the landscape of business ownership, it's only 3% of businesses that are owned by Black people. And so that's one area that I'm mentioning in particular because there's been more work, especially in the amongst economists, on looking at the Black-white wealth gap. The second area of intervention that I would like to flag is digital equity. So this is of course even more important since COVID, but the digital skills gap is something that is documented as well for immigrants. And small business owners, especially during this period, have had to make themselves a lot more present online and understand how to find new clients in other ways than traditionally. This is also linked to the idea of moving into industries that generate higher revenues. And finally, the third point, and this I'd probably like to come back to during the discussion, is having a quality and affordable care infrastructure. Care in general, because if after the pandemic, people still are not sure that we need care infrastructure, I wouldn't know what to say to these people at this point. But care in general, child care, elderly care, well-being. But when it comes to child care in particular, prior to the crisis, there was already a low supply of childcare spots in the country. We have the issue of childcare deserts. And this is an industry where immigrant women and especially immigrant women of color, are disproportionately overrepresented, right? They're overrepresented as childcare workers. Now, this is an area of potential growth because you can go up even though they're overrepresented, they're especially overrepresented in the lower wage occupations within childcare. So there is a path towards moving, and there's more potential towards moving into ownership, business ownership. And the crisis of childcare in the last years is due to many factors, including underfunding at the national level, but also there's been like a push of immigrant women, especially older immigrant women, out of that market as suppliers, as family child care providers. And this is in part because of increasing requirements in educational requirements for the daycare providers. And so this is resulting in a very serious drop in the availability of home-based childcare spots. This is a problem because on the supply side, the entrepreneurs that own these businesses they deliver a very valuable service to the community, not just their own community, because they have a culturally differentiated service that they're offering. Okay, people, meaning that other immigrant families of the same communities are often seeking their services. It's a benefit to immigrant children or children of immigrants. They provide opportunities for the wider community as well, since there's this gap, obviously, in the industry. So, and it's also very important to have those home family childcare centers because they offer a lot more flexibility. So for low income families in general, having access to those is important. You can pay on different types of payment plans compared to the regular daycare, the large daycare centers, or even the preschools. The scheduling is important because most low wage workers have non-standard working schedules, and they need access and they need flexibility. And so this is a big gap that has been even more, that has gotten greater with the pandemic. But I will highlight, just to finish, that there is a policy, there is a program in particular that is a good example of what we could do in that space. From the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is within the Department of Health and Human Services, they offer a home-based childcare program where they accompany refugees and train them to open their own businesses. And this has especially benefited immigrant women of color. And for just to give you a few statistics, for 2017, with a grant of about $1.5 million, they were able to train 250 people. 150 of them obtained their license and opened their childcare businesses. And this, from their estimate, resulted to about 1,000 new childcare spots. So I'll stop here, but I'm happy to come back to most of these points. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll jump to Dr. Vasco Yasenov.
So my name is Vasco Yasenov. I am a data scientist at the Immigration Policy Lab at Stanford, and I just want to briefly introduce. So we're a group of diverse group of social scientists, which we do academic research on kind of what works for integration of various immigrants, refugees included. and also kind of the interaction between policy and immigrants. So how do certain policies affect immigrants, not just in the US, but globally as well? And also what impacts do immigrants have on labor markets, on economies, and so on. I particularly focus on the US, and while today I'm not going to talk specifically about immigrants and entrepreneurship directly, I would build on something that Dr. Kasvin earlier mentioned, which is nonprofits. And I would like to share a couple of slides. I only have 3 slides, and I'll be very brief. So let me see if this is gonna be fine. So I want to introduce one research project that my group and I have been working for a few years now. Let's see, how do I go to full screen? So this is a co-authored with a lot of my colleagues at the Immigration Policy Lab here. And the main goal of this project is to gather a comprehensive database of nonprofit organizations in the US that provide sort of low cost or no cost services to immigrants. So I'm gonna call these organizations ISPs, and this stands for Immigrant Service Providers. So this is kind of one of the first efforts of a comprehensive database of all really nonprofits in the US that are related to kind of low skill immigrants. We then supplement this with zip code census level data on where do immigrants live and how many immigrants are in each locations. And one of our main goals is to identify these service deserts, which I'm not going to talk about in these introducing remarks, but can come up later on. So locations that have a lot of low-skill immigrants, but either don't have an ISP, don't have a nonprofit organization, or the nearest ISP is relatively far away. And the last thing that we do in the paper is to use some kind of spatial, like very simple spatial algorithms to identify ways that we can improve this network. Sort of where can we get the biggest bang for the buck of if we were to introduce new nonprofits. And I want to highlight here that, I mean, this is something that we're currently working on, but we hypothesize that these nonprofits, and that's what I think Dr. Kasvin earlier mentioned, is that they probably have some relevance for economic outcomes and economic prosperity, such as, finding employment and entrepreneurship. And mainly through the channel of the main thing that they do is help immigrants with legal documents, sort of maybe transition to green card or naturalize or change type of visa that can allow you to stay here longer. So this is a map. This is the map of the US. Each red dot here is a different ISP. We ended up finding about 2,100, a bit more than 2,100 ISPs. And with blue here, we highlight the number of immigrants. I think we build up this up to the county level in this map. I mean, few patterns stand out, but I don't want to spend too much time in these introducing remarks. I'm just going to summarize the three takeaways that we got from this research project. And I can easily put up a link to the paper. The paper is available online, and I invite every interested listener to go in and dig deeper, and of course reach out if something is unclear. So the main takeaways are that most low-skill immigrants generally live relatively close to an ISP. So here I have about 75% of them are located within 6 or 7 miles of an ISP, and you could kind of see that earlier on the map where you have these big clusters of ISPs in metropolitan areas where there are a lot of low-income immigrants. When it comes to service deserts, there are service deserts in various places, but one of the patterns that we saw is that they tend to be these kind of mid-sized cities and primarily located in the South, which are kind of new destinations for immigrants in the US. Here, I've put a couple of examples. And there were about 10.4 low-income immigrants in here. When I say low income, I mean below 150% of the federal poverty line. So there are about 10.4 million immigrants, and 1.6 out of these 10.4 are located relatively further from an ISP, which is 12 miles or further. So that's our criterion for access in the paper. And through our spatial algorithm, we identified that adding new ISPs in optimally in each state could significantly actually increase access to these and diminish this gap of, I think just adding one ISP in each state can decrease this 1.6 million unserved to by 70%. So kind of almost close the gap of service. And this is where I'm going to stop, and I'm happy to take questions later on, just for the interest of time.
Thank you. And I think, Mr. Mohammed, you are up now.
First off, thank you to the Kauffman Foundation for recognizing the long and deep relationship that the Immigrant Learning Center in Massachusetts has with immigrant entrepreneurs and the research behind immigrant entrepreneurship. I would also like to thank the immigrant entrepreneur who founded Zoom, who is allowing me to participate not from Boston, where I typically am, but actually from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, which is my home country. The Immigrant Learning Center has been around since 1992, and we actually started out and still provide free English classes to immigrant and refugee adults. And we've served more than 11,000 to date. And the idea behind that was that language is the vehicle through which immigrants are allowed to succeed in the United States. After 9/11, though, we realized we needed to educate not just immigrants, we needed to educate Americans about who immigrants are and the kinds of contributions they make. So we started this public education institute that I lead right now to tell the other side of the story, to counter that anti-immigrant sentiment. And we do this through research, through public education, conference presentations, Zoom webinars without the audio problems, to inform policymakers, to inform the field, and to give advocates the tools they need to advance more sensible policies locally at the state level and at the federal level. We've published research locally, regionally, and nationally. One of our studies was co-authored with the American Immigration Council and the United States Chamber of Commerce. And finally, we started the Institute for Immigration Research at George Mason University, which is about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old now. And they publish research at local and national levels, looking at the contributions of immigrants, the impact immigrants have through their being workers and their being entrepreneurs in their communities. And you can actually request a free fact sheet on the immigrants in your locality with their immigration data on demand service, which is incredible, and it's free. So our relationship with immigrant entrepreneurs really started out with the research. We wanted to find out, well, are immigrants a net benefit to America? And we found out, lo and behold, they are and always have been. And this is in part because the act of migrating is itself an entrepreneurial act. You leave everything behind, you take a risk, you don't know what to expect, you don't know the culture, you don't know the laws, you don't know how to take the bus, but you hope for something better. And that entrepreneurial spirit has been with people who have moved to the United States, whether by force or choice or not, ever since. And so we host an annual Immigrant Entrepreneur Awards that honors businesses from the mom and pop Main Street level all the way up to high tech and life science. And the woman in the red jacket there, Bettina Hine, I'm going to make reference to her in a little bit in terms of visa issues and how America is not welcoming to immigrant entrepreneurs. But the main point I want to emphasize in this discussion is how inherently American immigrant entrepreneurship is. This is Fields Corner in Boston, which was very rundown a generation ago. Today, it's populated with Vietnamese nail salons, restaurants, grocery stores, businesses that have uplifted the neighborhood, made it safer, made it a destination to get your nails done or to get certain types of food. And this is an inherently American story. We see this in the North End in Boston, which is now a tourist attraction. We see it in Philadelphia. Our last speaker was from Philadelphia with the 9th Street Italian Market. This is not an immigrant story, it's an American story. And I'll really make reference to this graphic that some of the most iconic American brands like Levi's jeans or Coors Beer were founded by immigrants. It is not a new phenomenon. It always has been that way, that immigrants found businesses, big or small. They start off small generally, Sears, Nordstrom, for instance, and they become iconic American brands. So the narrative around immigration in America is not a separate narrative to what benefits America. And I think that the idea of policies, whether local or beyond, immigrants aren't over there. They aren't on the hill. They're among us. And so any policy that we think of needs to have that intersectional lens and include immigrants, whatever they may be. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you to all of the panelists for sharing your thoughts. And what I've done is I've pulled out some of the themes that have come up through your remarks, and I wanted to raise some questions that you could all comment on, and some are directed specifically to a few of you, and some are broader. So, I think that the first question that I'd like all of you to respond to is, there's a lot of diversity in the word immigrant and in the lived experience of immigrants. And for example, Dr. Yasenov talked about proximity to service providers, and Dr. Kerr talked about a wide variety today, as well as in his previous work, of different policies that could affect people differently. And we've also heard about, in particular, how Dr. Lacarte talked about caregiving and the unique relationship for some immigrants with caregiving, as well as, of course, more broadly for all of us. And so I think that the question I'd really like you to reflect on is, how does the diversity of what is embodied in this word immigrant and in the lived experience of immigrants actually affect economic engagement? And how can policymakers and practitioners and service providers know what questions to be asking? So what should they be asking to be able to understand these are the types of constraints, or these are the types of opportunities that I should consider? And it's posed to all of you, so whoever would like to go first.
Nadia, I would like to start answering that question. I think it's very important that both researchers and policymakers look at the diversity of immigrant groups that we have, because these are very different experiences. Whether it's somebody who comes here on a non-immigrant status as a international student, or work visa, or business visa, already with skills, already with language, and has some time before becoming an immigrant and starting a business. It has some time to develop those social networks and sharpen the skills, versus somebody who comes here on asylum, or somebody comes here as a refugee. And specifically to the group I know most about, refugees, I want to say thank you to Dr. Mohammed for talking about immigration as an act of entrepreneurship, because it takes a special kind of courage to leave everything that you know and move forward to the unknown. And for decades in our field of refugee resettlement, I think we had a false narrative of refugees are different from immigrants because we didn't have a choice. We had to run, but everybody has a choice, and refugees had a choice too. You could have stayed and continued to experience persecution, maybe die, or you could take a risk and move forward towards unknown in the hopes of building a better life. And especially with refugees, some significant number of refugees did not just come to the United States directly from their country of origin. They experienced the refugee journey as they moved from one country to another, sometimes spent decades in refugee camps or in urban environment where they had to survive without having a benefit of a local government welcoming them or even giving them a legal right to work. And so through that survival and trying to figure out the ways how to support themselves, many started their small micro businesses in those different countries on their refugee journey. But also when people come here, to some extent, starting a business is a way of regaining control, of regaining that self-respect and self-sufficiency that for many refugees was denied on their way here and throughout their journey. So I think it's very important to look at these different experiences and from the point of research and also policymaking.
If I may, yes, I think that the heterogeneity issue is very important. We have, as I was mentioning earlier, it's very important to look at the local level, as Ms. Kasvin just mentioned, because it's really the local leaders, the community leaders who know what needs and which immigrant populations they should cater to and how to tailor the programs. There shouldn't be any assumptions, but I do think also that it's important to understand why people migrate, which groups of immigrants are migrating, and which categories they fall. The question of if people are creating businesses as necessity businesses, as was mentioned earlier, is very important, because if it's about discriminatory practices that are in the labor market, then that is not only limited to the labor market. It's also likely going to continue in the entrepreneurship space as well. In fact, even though the starting a business doesn't resolve these issues, and so even when it comes to access to credit, we talked about that, getting certain clients, there are limitations that specific groups will face. And for women, for instance, if the growth that we're seeing in women starting businesses, if it's motivated by the fact that women are feeling pushed out of the labor market because there's not enough job flexibility, then that also becomes an issue in the entrepreneurship space. There was a question in the chat, if I can answer that at the same time, about whether entrepreneurs in the childcare space have had issues with the COVID crisis. I think Professor Fairlie earlier showed the data on the fact that, yes, immigrant entrepreneurs have suffered even more from the COVID crisis. And so juggling the childcare, even for entrepreneurs who are in childcare, is in fact a challenge.
I can maybe take the next crack at the bat. I think this diversity of pathways, which we've commented upon, from a research side, we wish we could say more about how all these different pathways lead into business creation. But it's a challenge in the US for a couple of reasons. One, we clearly have a very complex, very vast immigration system, and there's multiple pathways that are coming into the country and many diversity of experiences. And the second kind of tension in that is we have a political process that sometimes has immigration as the third rail that you can't touch and is just generally not very fast moving. And so as I reflect upon that diversity and trying to come to the impact for immigrant entrepreneurship, one thing I would start with is I think we need to respect the pathways that, what is the pathway into the country seeking to achieve? And that could have different implications for immigrant entrepreneurship. So if the pathway is for family reunification, for bringing families back together, which is the majority of immigration into the country, then the hope that I would have is that we create a good level playing field for entrepreneurship, and that we let people be able to select into it when it's the appropriate opportunity, that we're supportive, but we're not trying to overly channel that in, because the primary goal was family reunification. And then there's a second part where we have migration that's more related to work reasons. A lot of our system, as we highlighted earlier, is employer driven. And there I want to make sure that we are creating the right opportunities for people to be able to found companies as well as go work for larger entities. And so I think trying to, in that employer-driven channel, be able to make the right environment. And where this kind of ultimately also leads me in trying to think about this diversity is we often have in our immigration laws have had kind of, this big battle. We set a new sort of policy. We have a big immigration act, something big happens. And then there's like 2 decades of struggle until, we get the next kind of big opportunity to reform something. And if we can, given how diverse this pathway is and how difficult it is for us right now to anticipate all those needs, the more we can design flexibility into the programs that we create so that they can scale up and down with the economy, that we haven't fought over some rigid number of visas for some category that then can become outdated over time. The more we can sort of appreciate that we're not a country that's really set up for this year-to-year tinkering with the immigration system that you see in other countries, the more I think we'll be able to service a long-term need when we are able to make some of the changes.
Really quickly, building off what William just said, I think the pandemic is a prime example of the flexibility that we need. For instance, we know Bloomberg and the New American Economy talk about the language and cultural barriers that policymakers need to understand, access to capital, a lack of understanding of regulations. And trust me, as an immigrant to America, the regulations are intense. But credentialing and licensing, when the pandemic hit, certain states reduced or adjusted licensing and credentialing requirements for foreign-trained healthcare professionals in order to benefit the local communities that needed these workers. So the flexibility that William is talking about is, we should not have to wait and have states do it. States can do it, but these are the kinds of things that policymakers need to anticipate.
And I want to add here, so clearly this heterogeneity or diversity of immigration, I think everybody would agree that this is a big issue, especially in a country as diverse as the US. And I think the panelists here touched on all the right points. But one thing that I want to add is, as an academic researcher, to be able to provide kind of evidence to policymakers of what works for, for whatever, for integration, for entrepreneurship of immigrants. One thing that we need is more data. If you want to say, if you want to make statements about different groups and different types of immigrants, richer and more detailed data is one way to do that. And I've seen recently so for example, one example where this is relevant is data from the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which was just about a year or two was publicly available. Now it's no longer publicly available. So as researcher, that is kind of a factor that really diminishes our ability to make statements about different kinds of immigrants. And yeah, I hope policymakers just either make richer data more available, or kind of take down some of these barriers that are out there, so we can provide better evidence for different groups.
Thank you. And so I wanted to touch on something that's come up both in this roundtable and in the previous panel, which is around support for immigrants, and more broadly think about what are the opportunities and the constraints. And so when we think about people that have, for example, transnational networks, or access to resources outside of the United States, but also face barriers in many cases to access to resource in the United States. How does that all come together? And specifically, I'd be interested in each panelist sharing where you think there is something very unique about the immigrant or immigration experience that affects entrepreneurship and economic engagement, and where you think there is something that policymakers or practitioners really do need to understand about the nature of this transnational movement. Okay.
I could start. I'm not sure. I'm going to have, I think, two different versions of this or ways of trying to think about this. So one is if I was to have a chance to talk to a policymaker about this, and I'm thinking more about the very high growth oriented firms that are being created, Silicon Valley, Boston startup companies. So one of the things that I would recognize or try to have them appreciate is the level of competition that is for these companies. And if you do have a transnational network, if you do have possibly a foot in 2 or 3 different places to begin with, which we see a lot of this among the immigrant students that are at Harvard Business School and the companies that they're founding. They may have an R&D center in Israel, and they may have a co-founder that's living in Paris, something like that. These location choices do get influenced by how well they're being able to be integrated into the local areas. And you can have tipping points between the facility could end up in Boston, the center of gravity going forward, or it could end up somewhere else. And so that needs to be considered. And then the second thing that is really more of a broader kind of piece for the landscape of immigration, which Tamara earlier was describing Korean businesses and their formation, that I would just like to supersize in this conversation. We see, while there's a very diverse experiences across the different ethnic groups, one quite common trend we see is a lot of concentration of immigrants into certain industry spaces. And it was mentioned earlier, Vietnamese nail care salons. I think it's on the order of 1/3 of hotels, motels in the United States are owned by Gujarati Indians, Punjabi Indian convenience stores. You can kind of keep on going through this list. And so recognizing as a policymaker, you have some sort of, you need to perhaps be appreciative of this industry concentration where it's happening for groups as a consequence of this sort of need and / advantage in the local community to be able to access these resources and build upon them.
And I would like to add as a question about unique immigrant experiences. I think that creation of small businesses is to some extent addresses the issue that we have in the United States of brain waste and skill waste. And it's due to many different things, whether it's language barrier, cultural barrier, but also a very complex professional and trade licensing that we've done a lot of advocacy. We continue to do a lot of advocacy, but it's very, very difficult to break through. And so by creating a business, we kind of we address the issue of all that waste that we experience.
Great. And actually, I wanted to follow up on something that has come up several times, which is this idea of industry concentration and the sort of push or pull. I'm not actually sure. And so if you could talk a little bit about two things. The first is this good or bad that you see so much industry concentration, in particular in some industries? And the second is, what is driving that? And are those things that could extend to expand in other industries, or are these specific to the industry? Are these specific to the immigrants? Are these specific to the ethnic groups or the immigrant groups that are doing the concentrating? What is actually driving this?
A lot of it has to do just with filling gaps, right? Where immigrants move to where the jobs are. So meatpacking plants in Nebraska, for instance, or we think of STEM fields, where there are gaps, the immigrants move there. So they're filling roles that Americans currently aren't playing. And I just want to make a point that, there's always the argument about, well, why aren't more Americans going into STEM fields? A portion of the H-1B visa cost actually goes toward promoting STEM for American students. But I think William and others can add to the data.
I think building on these comments that there are certainly a little bit of all the above, Sami, to the kind of like the description you just provide. We have examples of immigrant groups that take their skill sets around the world with them, or to Denzil's point, that they're going after specific opportunities. One thing though about the clustering that we observe is that it's not just a US phenomenon. It's present in a lot of different locations. And so a lot of different countries around the world. And a lot of times even the industry that the clustering of one group has can vary across countries. And one of the hypotheses that I've been working with recently is around the social networks that exist among immigrant communities, and the capacity of entrepreneurship to sit well within that. So the idea is that if you are going every week to a school for your kids to learn the native, the home country language, or if there's certain religious events that you're a regular part of, if you have jointly chosen to be running motels, then you could be sharing information and mentorship and guidance and giving first job opportunities in that social group that's complementary to the business side. And that would suggest that it's not predominantly a push factor or something about lack of other opportunities, that this is more of a positive story. And one piece of evidence that we have around that is that when you get all these big data sets and you run the regressions and all that kind of stuff that us in academia get to do with our lives, you do find that the immigrants that are working in a concentrated industry space with other self-employed immigrants of their ethnic nationality tend to be doing better financially in terms of their take-home income than if they were working in alternative spaces, and also compared to others that are in the industry space. So it doesn't seem to be a case of being forced into one area, although certainly in some situations that has happened.
Yes, I think definitely this conversation is very related to the whole research on ethnic enclaves, right? And so, and the network aspect, I think that's critical in this case, because if you're looking at it as in terms of good or bad, it's not necessarily. It really would depend basically on what group you're looking at and where they're concentrated. If in the case of, I think I mentioned this in a comment, in response to a comment, when you're looking at Black immigrants, often from some of the evidence in studies, they show that they often start off their businesses, their startup funds are actually higher than US born Black Americans, right? But eventually, in terms of the business outcomes, a lot of the characteristics of the industries where they end up is very close to the US born Americans. So there may be other factors that have to do with networks that, leads them to be concentrated in certain industries. And if these industries are not the high revenue ones, then that is problematic. And it's very close to the discussion as well on, the formal labor market, like occupational segregation and this type of issue. So I think it's very specific to certain groups.
Great. And then the last question that I had is, there's been quite a bit of conversation in particular around forced migration, and there are areas of that conversation that are around things, for example, like status and authorization to work permits, and that type of thing. But there's also some other conversations around the generational effects of movement. And so one thing I just wanted to raise, both in the context of refugee entrepreneurs, but also in the context of all immigrants more broadly, is a question around what do we know about generational effects? And the reason I raised refugee entrepreneurs specifically is because there are certainly some differences in terms of access to things like records from your home country if there has been massive destruction of institutions, right? So that makes many things difficult. But in general, what do we know about the generational effects? It was touched on briefly. When we're looking at the second generation, the third generation, how do these outcomes matter, and what do we know about what shapes them? So, so for example, if an immigrant owns a business, is there anything that we can learn about what to expect in terms of ability to invest in the family or in the household, in the community, and how that may unfold over generations? And I don't know of that, and that's why I'm raising it. I haven't actually seen that. I don't know of any research on this question.
Well, I'm not a doctor and not a researcher, but but there is certainly something to say about that drive that you know, we have when we come to this country to succeed in spite all odds, all the barriers, and to create a better life for our children. I mean, we can't underestimate that, and that drive, that's a great push.
Speaking from the research side, this is a very frontier question, and it's very difficult for us to really to get a handle on. Sari mentioned in the first session some evidence that when you look at second generation immigrants, they tend to bridge the gap between, you know, what multiple generation Americans look like in terms of their business creation and what first generation for their community look like. But that's a very rare study, in part because being able to observe multiple generations and link that into business formation data has been a long challenge. Let's hope that we'll overcome that challenge, but it's been a long one. One thing I'll broaden the question a little bit and also try to pick up on a couple of the Q&A things that have been coming through the chat line. So there's been this kind of a question about, we see so much immigrant entrepreneurship. What is, you know, is there really a problem here? And you've seen that it can scale up and become a Fortune 500 company, but it's not, you know, like, is there something to worry about here? And I think across the panel conversation, I look at this as being, there's a number of things that are leading people to the opportunity that Nadia just described, to want to come to America and to want to be a part of it. Huge product markets. You know, one immigrant entrepreneur told me, you know, that more or less back home, there was the overhang of a few, you know, family-owned firms that were in close kind of cahoots with the government and the president, and there was never a way for that individual to really try a business, you know, and to imagine the business scaling up. But America gave them that opportunity. And so that power has been very strong for our country for a long time, and it's something that we of course want to continue. It's been that some of the challenges of being able to pursue that desire have gotten in the way. And that's what we're hoping that we can overcome, and to be able to provide more opportunities for people to be able to pursue their businesses in the country, if that's what they want to do. And then ideally pass that either in the terms of family wealth or in terms of a family business or in terms of some other know-how down to their kids.
Okay, great. And so I think we are actually over time or out of time. And I want to thank the 5 participants in our roundtable. It's really great to be able to bring research and practice together and hear your shared perspectives about several topics. And so thank you very much. I'd like to thank, I think they may not be here, but I'd like to thank the panelists from panel 1 and panel 2 for giving us their time and sharing their thoughts. Really want to thank our 2 moderators as well. This is the conclusion of this forum. One thing I wanted to highlight is at the end of February, we will be having a similar forum or another forum, and the subject for that forum is the return of formerly incarcerated citizens into society and how entrepreneurship plays a role in that. And so please stay tuned for details on that forum at the end of February. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be sharing this video very shortly. Thank you again.